In 1974, a low-budget Hindi film created ripples in the world of Indian cinema. At a time when the notion of good cinema was primarily associated with regional language films, this sensitive portrayal of feudal values and rural exploitation became a critical and commercial success.
दंडम तोड़ा। आप अंदर बैठो छोटे सरकार, मैं सामान लेके आती हूँ।
Ankur, the first feature film by Shyam Benegal, went on to win accolades and brought instant recognition to his extraordinary talent. Shyam Benegal's career, spanning over 15 years in feature films, coincides with an exciting period of the new Indian cinema. The films of Satyajit Ray, Mrinal Sen, and other regional directors created an ambience, an audience, which began to accept serious Indian films. For his part, Benegal avoided the self-consciousness of much of art cinema, concentrating instead on narrative communication, traversing what some critics called the path of the middle road cinema.
I grew up in Hyderabad. Hyderabad meaning actually in a cantonment town. There used to be the Sikandrabad cantonment, which is a part of Hyderabad city. And my father was a still photographer, so that explains the family interest in photography and film and so on. Then too there was a cousin now, Gurudat for instance. Gurudat was coming into films in those days. His career was a kind of inspiration. I would sort of very keenly listen to what he was doing whenever there was talk about Gurudat. And when he did come on holidays and things like that, my curiosity knew no end, you know. So that was how I think I was fired by this idea of wanting to become a filmmaker.
Benegal's technical skills as a film director were honed in the many advertising films he made in Bombay. He migrated to this metropolis, working first as a copywriter and then directing ad shorts and documentaries. But it was the Telangana peasant movement of the 40s and 50s which shaped Benegal's ideological stance. This rural uprising in Andhra Pradesh was the first major agrarian revolt of independent India.
That was part of my growing up, and it had a tremendous amount of impact. And I had a lot of people I knew who had participated. And when I went into college, some of these people were released from jail, you know. They were, many of them were jailed and so on. They were released from jail, and some became my classmates, as a matter of fact. And they were part of my peer group, you know. So they had a tremendous amount of influence on me, particularly in the way I thought about the world, about the way things were moving, about society, Indian society, and so on and so forth.
The common theme in his early films was the class conflict in rural India, the changing power equations, and the challenge to feudalism. The director was responding to the social change around him.
बोलता क्यों नहीं? तुम्हारा घर वाला है?
जी हो सरकार, मेरा मर्द है ही नहीं।
क्या काम करता है?
काम सरकार कुछ भी नहीं करता, थोड़ा यट्टी बेगार कर लेता है।
तू क्या करती है?
मैं सरकार झाड़ू फाड़का करती हूँ।
That was a direct result of the changing of the feudal system. Hyderabad was changing from a feudal system to what it has now become. The whole attitude, the whole concepts of people on the land, there was a kind of, you know, relationship between the people who worked in the fields and the person who owned land. all those changes started to take place about the time I was growing up. And these relationships were changing. And that's directly related to all that. The breakdown of feudal concepts, feudal values in many ways, and nothing to replace it that was either better than the feudal values that existed, which were terrible in any case.
In his next film, Nishant, Benegal repeated the theme of rural oppression, this time symbolized by the kidnapping of the schoolmaster's wife by the zamindars.
मैं जाती हूँ।
खा लो बेटे, खाओ।
Whereas Ankur smoldered in its climax, Nishant explodes in an upheaval where the unleashed storm engulfs both the good and the bad. The social concerns Benegal repeats time and again in his films represent a commitment.
I feel that if you are with a medium, which is essentially a social medium like the cinema is, whether you like it or not, it's a social medium. It's not a medium like a painter's medium. Because it is a social medium, somewhere along the line, a sense of social responsibility does creep into it. You feel somehow responsible.
मैं तो देखूं तारी बाट दिन बीते नहीं रात कौने कहूँ दिल्ली बात मैं तो थाकी रे ना मैं गैया धोवा जाऊं ना मैं पानी भरवा जाऊं ना मैं सुख चैन पाऊं मारे घर आंगना ना भूलो ना।
The trilogy of Ankur, Nishant and Manthan are quintessential early Benegal. But it is in Manthan that he brings together the concerns of his earlier films in the story of the birth of a milk-producing cooperative. The conflict between the untouchables of the village and the rural vested comes to the fore in a film which was itself produced by 500,000 farmers of a Gujarat milk cooperative.
इस गांव के दूध उत्पादक सहकारी मंडली के नए प्रमुख हैं मोती। नहीं हो सकता, एक कभी नहीं हो सकता। मैं जिंदगी में आज तक इलेक्शन नहीं हारा। तुमने हमारी इज्जत माटी में मिला दी। तुम हमारे को जानते नहीं हो डॉक्टर। मेरी पंचायत में इलेक्शन में बड़े-बड़े नेताओं भाषण देने आते हैं और तुम्हारी इस फटीचर सोसाइटी पद के लिए मेरी नाक कटवा दिया तुमने। मगर गांव में पंचायती बात चलती है। तुम चाहते हो सोसाइटी पंचायत की जगह ले ले, ये नहीं हो सकता। जाओ जाओ दोबारा पर्ची डालो और इस बार मेरा नाम आना चाहिए।
An interesting aspect of Shyam Benegal's career has been the extraordinary number of young talents he has fostered. His filmography is studied with debuts by technicians and actors who moved out of his shadow to become major talents in their own right. Govind Nihalani, his cameraman for the early films, Shabana Azmi, Smita Patil, Nasiruddin Shah, Om Puri, Kulbhushan Kharbanda.
Once you know your actors, once you know all the members of your unit, you know, where you're not changing people around all the time, it's easier to get everybody locked into the same kind of consciousness, you know. And it helps because it saves on time. You have a much more precise manner of communicating with each other. And in addition to that, you know that everybody is going in the same direction as you have planned. People are not, have not misunderstood the signals, you know, because that often happens in films. You can have actors making their own film, acting in a film that is not necessarily the film that is being made.
In 1988, Shyam Benegal set to work on a major television serial, Bharat Ek Khoj, and documenting him at work was the cinematographer of his early films, Govind Nihalani.
As a director, he does not treat you only as a person doing a particular job. Most of his films have been shot on location, where the entire unit goes and lives on the location, and a feeling of togetherness grows because you have breakfast together, you travel together, then you shoot together, you come back together, you have dinner together, and then you chat and you know, celebrate, because invariably in Shyam's unit you have several birthdays coming and everybody, you know, has his little party, little celebration. That contributes a lot to creating this tremendous family feeling.
In Ankur, Shyam was assisted by a technical team which was largely uninitiated to feature films, and he cast a young Film Institute graduate in the lead role. Shabana Azmi went on to win the National Award for Best Actress that year.
As far as the main part is concerned, Shabana's part was very interesting because, you see, the first person I had asked was Wahida, because I could see Wahida in my mind for that particular part. She said yes in the beginning, but later on she wasn't sure she could do it, so she said no. So that sent me into a tizzy, and I asked several other people, among whom were Sharda, you know, from the south, who was not sure whether she could speak Hindi well enough or Dakhni well enough. Then I asked Aparna. Even she wasn't very sure, and eventually said no. And while this was going on, I had this girl come from the Film Institute.
He just looked at me without looking at the photographs, and within 5 minutes he said, "You're going to do Ankur, and there's also going to be, this is going to be followed up by a sequel called Nishant, and you're going to do that as well." I couldn't quite believe that. And then he had a look at my photographs and sort of hummed and hawed and said, "Well, I think we'll leave these photographs alone and I'll take another photographic session." And I came home and I told my mother, I just met some fraud guy who says I'm going to be in 2 films, and of course it doesn't mean anything because he hardly asked me any questions at all. And then 15 days later there was this script in my house, and before I knew it, in 18 days exactly, on the 18th of August 1973, I think we went. And we completed the film on the 18th of September.
The difference between a good actor and not so good an actor, I think, is their own insights into a part. And most of these people are extremely insightful actors and actresses. The last scene in Ankur with Shabana, I spoke to her at length about some scene I remember in a newsreel that I had seen, you know, during the Bangladesh war, where there was this woman who lost her entire family, and she was crying inconsolably. You know, I said, this is, it's a kind of limit to which you come to, you know.
All along I knew that this was my important scene and everything depended on that scene. And at the time that I was supposed to perform it, I went into a complete blank and I would feel absolutely no emotion at all. And I thought this was it. I mean, this is just gone. And Shyam saw me, and he saw me in that state, and he said, "You can just go and take some time." He got Govind to set the camera completely. And I just sat there absolutely cold, and I said, "I can't do it because I feel absolutely nothing." And I'd done it in my mind several times, and it had hit me each time, and it was strange that this had happened. And he just came to me, and he didn't speak about this particular scene at all. He said, he started talking to me, I remember, about a Bangladesh refugee. And I had seen that film, I think it was Sukhdev's film or something like that. And he just started talking to me about her. As I'm telling you this, I'm getting goose flesh. And I remember being very, very moved by it. And he saw me and he said, all right, she's ready. And he just took me in front of the camera, and that's how it worked.
मारा तूने हराम के जने क्यों मारा माटी मिले इन्हें मुंह नहीं तो बाबा काम मांगने आया था इसको मारा तेरे दिल में काला था इस वास्ते डराना तू तेरी शान मिट्टी में मिले तू बड़ा आदमी अपने घर का होएगा समझे हम तेरे खरीदे गुलाम नहीं है हमको तेरा काम नहीं होना तेरा पैसा नहीं होना तेरा कुछ नहीं होना सब अपने मुर्दे के साथ लेगा तू मेरे मर्द को मारा तेरे को परमात्मा की मार पड़ेगी तू कभी नहीं पनपेगा तेरे गरीबों की हार ली है ना तू कभी नहीं पनपेगा
What I like about Shyam is that he never attempts to translate for the actor, which is a quality of a great director. Otherwise, one tends to, because it's easier to explain, instead of explaining the background to the actor, give him a gesture. Now, sometimes he does that with non-actors or with children, but otherwise, he arouses the feelings in you by explaining you the background, and therefore giving also respect to the actors and allowing them to create themselves. Because whatever eventually, if you copy a gesture told by the director, at best what you can do is you can copy that. It won't be your own.
यदि वो अलग-अलग समूह में बंटकर अलग-अलग स्थानों से हम पर आक्रमण करेंगे तो हम उन्हें पराजित नहीं कर पाएंगे और महाराज कलिंग की प्रजा उन्हें शरण देना पुण्य का काम समझती है तो यहाँ पे
ये वो ठीक है.
The idea is to fight the battle according to our terms. जो अंग्रेजी में लिखा था करेक्ट था on our terms, not on our borders.
अच्छा what is that line you are
The scene is complete.
With a large filmography to his credit, 15 feature films and documentaries, in most of his films, Shyam Benegal works with gifted collaborators on the script, synthesizing from their contributions his own particular worldview and sensibility.
Junoon was based on The Flight of Pigeons, which was written by Ruskin Bond. But Ankur was my own story and script. So was Thrikal, my own story and script. But Junoon's script was mine. So I've written scripts without collaborators as well. But most of my other films have always had collaborators or direct writers. You know, there have been a combination of writers or there's just been one writer.
यदि प्रजा और राज्य की रक्षा नहीं कर सकता तो उसे राज सिंहासन पर बैठने का कोई अधिकार नहीं. ऐसा लगता है आप सुशील से घृणा करते हैं. हाँ हाँ करता.
We have how much dialogue on that?
That is only from this chakra. The main part is the chakra view torna.
Yeah. So वहाँ से.
And that is KK's back long shot. So
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because we've seen him for so long.
And I feel the feeling of conspiracy.
Yeah, will become so that you have to leave them in some isolation.
Yeah.
उसने भरी सभा में मेरे सिर पर चपत मार दी. क्या? हाँ. सबके सामने.
If I can help it, I wouldn't like to leave the decisions, the creative decisions, to the editing table. I'd like to see that what I shoot is edited the way I have shot it and meant to be edited. Now this does happen. Most of the times this does happen, but there are some sequences, certain kinds of things where you may have also conceived it not as clearly when you were shooting it. So when you have sequences like that, then of course a lot of the damage has to be corrected on the editing table.
Polite!
चलो चलो आगे ले लो हटो हटो चलो भागो हटो
सुनिए आपने हमारी उषा जी का डांस देखा
In Bhumika, Benegal moved from the rural exploitation theme to a study of the woman. The film, based on the life of Marathi actress Hansa Vadkar, came to symbolize the technical excellence and narrative skill of the director.
In terms of technique and so on, all its flashbacks, flash forwards, change of colors, change of stocks, in fact, used as part of interpretation. Because I used all kinds of things in that. I used black and white, then tinted black and white, different kinds of tints, like sepia, green, blue, amber, all sorts of things like that. Plus, I used the very old stock, like, Geva color, the first Geva color stock that came to India in the monopack system, then also Orvo, and then Eastman, in the manner in which these stocks had come to India, within the film industry itself. So this was one of the things I did with Bhumika, but it didn't seem to me that Bhumika was a very complicated project.
Bhumika was particularly exciting because there we were dealing with 4 distinct periods of evolution of Indian cinema, and with it the evolution of cinematic style, the cinematographic style of those periods. We went to the Film Institute archives and had a look at several films of various periods and studied their lighting styles, studied their compositions, and tried to incorporate them in the film, which was a very challenging, at the same time very satisfying experience.
बेताल के शौर्य को नहीं पहचानती, तुम मेरे क्रोध को नहीं जानती। मेरे इस अग्नि महल से आज तक कोई भी कुमारी जिंदा नहीं बच सकी है। मैं तुम्हारे सौंदर्य को जलाकर राख कर दूंगा। अग्नि!
It was also in this film that he drew out a brilliant performance from Smita Patil in what was only her 3rd film and her 2nd major role.
डायलॉग बोलने की जरूरत नहीं है। उस बार घर ले आया था, बार बार नहीं लाऊंगा।
तो मरने क्यों नहीं दिया मुझे? क्यों वापस ले आए?
गलती की।
मेरी कमाई की जरूरत है, इसीलिए ना। तुम्हारे बिन जीना लगे घर में, बलम जी तुमसे मिला के अखियाँ, बलम जी तुमसे मिला के अखियाँ, तुम्हारे बिन जीना लगे घर में, बदल गई मैं तो।
Smita was not a trained actress. With her, the approach had to be different. Her Bhumika part, for instance, I had been talking to her for about 6 months. Through the time we were shooting Manthan. After that, then we had all gone off to Cannes Film Festival with Nishant. I was talking to her in Cannes about it, in Paris about it, in London about it, back in Bombay again, and going on and on and on and on like this, because at that time I had this feeling that she wasn't quite serious about her position as an actress. I felt that she hadn't quite made her commitment to the profession. She had to go through all kinds of things, well before we started shooting the film. And I felt it was necessary for her to go through all this. She used to go for dancing lessons to Khar every day for 2 or 3 hours. Then early in the morning she had to wake up and go for riding lessons. Then she had to come and do her fencing lessons. So I used to keep her completely occupied for about 8 or 9 hours of the day, only to keep her focus from shifting. This really had very little to do with what she actually did in the film.
दुनिया मेरे कदम चूमती है, पर मेरे एक इशारे पर दुनिया तुम्हारे कदम चूमेगी। मेरी मोहब्बत को कबूल करो उषा। मैं तुम क्या हुआ?
Shyam Benegal's subsequent partnership with Shashi Kapoor realized his most stylish period. Junoon was based on a short story by Ruskin Bond, A Flight of the Pigeons.
लानत है इन कबूतरों पर, खबीस, मकरू, चौधरी परिंदे। इनकी बहूदी में हमारे सिपाहियों की मौत लिखी है। हजार बार लानत है इन पर, इब्लीस की औलाद। देखना हराम है। रुक जाओ, छोड़िए मुझे। रुक जाओ, नहीं तो मैं तुम्हें जान से मार डालूंगा। इन्हें बचाने के लिए आप मुझ पर हाथ उठाएंगे, मुल्क के लिए नहीं। इन्हीं खुदगर्जियों ने तो हमें दगा दिया जावेद भाई। हम दिल्ली हार गए हैं। दगा, दगा।
To create a sense of period, you have to fall on certain kinds of schemes, which makes people feel that they have been transported into that century or that particular period within the same century, into that decade or whatever. Now, in this case, the whole emphasis was to create a certain kind of warmth, in the color schemes.
We were trying to deal with a period which has been documented very well in lithographs, in prints, you know, the British period. And we didn't want to totally follow that style. Yet, since the period has become identified with those visual representations, we didn't want to move away from it either. So we tried to find a balance between the two. And I think that worked out very, very well.
But Junoon is more than just style and polish. The obsessive love of a Pathan soldier for an English girl is set against the tragic backdrop of the 1857 Sepoy Mutiny. In the understated, quiet tone of the film, Benegal avoids major compromises to popular cinema.
इश्क ने तोड़ी सर पे कयामत, जोरे कयामत क्या कहिए, सुनने वाला कोई नहीं, रुदा दे
It's your own sensibility, your reaction to something, to a story or whatever. I do use melodrama, but I use it when it is credible, not when it is incredible.
The stylishness of Junoon and Kalyug was further extended by Benegal in a film he made in 1986. Trikal is set in the liberation days of Goa. It moves backwards and forwards between time planes and captures exquisitely the social and political ambience.
In this particular house, this kind of the house it was, the kind of color scheme that was worked out for it, based on what it was like when people actually lived in that house, you know, about 30 or 40 years before. Nitish had worked out the schemes based on the motifs that the house actually had. And once we had worked out all those color schemes, we felt that if we were going to shoot night sequences in this place, then it would be wonderful to try and shoot with oil lamps. Now that wasn't very practical. So what we did was we said we can shoot in candlelight. Now we had 400 ASF film. It was possible to do that. So Ashok did a few tests. And once those tests were done, we found that we could expose and we could get the kind of depth we wanted by using certain kind of candles. So all the night sequences in the film were shot actually in candlelight, except to use HMI lights for, to give a certain kind of depth in the landscape. You know, you get a certain moonlit quality and so on and so forth. But in the interiors and for the characters, we had nothing but candles to light them up.
जाओ बेटा.
डॉक्टर परेरा, मुझे लगता है ये सब अफवाहें हैं.
नहीं, अफवाहें नहीं है. पुल और सरकारी इमारतों के आसपास बारूद जमा किया जा रहा है. इंडियन आर्मी आएगी तो पोर्चुगीज सरकार सब कुछ उड़ा देगी. पूरा गोवा चलेगा.
डॉक्टर परेरा की फूल मालाएं तैयार हैं इंडियन आर्मी के लिए.
Once again, the visual approach Benegal employs complements the nostalgic recreation of a period which is coming to an end in a subdued but effective manner.
Another thing that I felt was very important for that film was to get the character of languidity, you know. Life in that sort of situation is a little more languid, certainly on the surface. And to get that, I needed a certain fluid kind of style. So we used a lot of the spider dolly, and we had these very long takes. We didn't cut too much when we were shooting our sequences. All the staging of the scenes were done in a manner where we wouldn't keep chop, 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 chop all the time. Thekal and Bhumika were not, they were narratives. At base is the narrative, a skeletal structure on which you have to place something on. But the plot is not necessarily of great importance to me. People are, characters are, you know. What emerges, what changes. I'm more interested in looking at the process, because process is probably the most elusive thing to register. You can register a pre-changed and a changed condition, but the process of change itself is very difficult to register, and it's fascinating to look at this. It's much like a shadow of the sun, you know, when the lengthening of shadows. You don't see the shadows actually lengthening. You see it when it has lengthened or when the shadow is short.
This process of change has been documented time and again in Benegal's films. In Susman, he studies the impact of the coming of the power looms and the modern textile buyers into the world of the traditional weavers. Although the film was not enthusiastically received, it remains, in terms of its sensitivities, consistent with his concern for the rural poor.
चलो करके पे बैठेगा तो टांगा तोड़ दूंगा तेरी।
ऐसा काहे को बोल रहे हैं? एक तो भी दिन बैठना ही चाहिए उसको करके पर।
इन्हें नहीं बैठेगा करके पर। पढ़ लिख को बड़ा आदमी बनेगा। मैं मेरे बेटे को बंद नहीं करूंगा इस पिंजरे में।
तो क्या बीमा के वैसा बनाएंगे? ना घर का ना घाट का?
In 1982, Shyam Benegal made a film financed by the West Bengal government. Arohan typifies the social commitment which has dominated his films. A commitment which is not the polemical stand of an activist, but the vision of a poet, capturing the charm, that rural poverty and oppression bring in their wake.
Paji! पाजी, 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 मैं तेरी माँ हूँ, मेरी तरफ देख, मुझे नहीं पहचाना, पाजी, पाजी, देख, मैं तेरी माँ हूँ, ऐसे मत देख, क्या हुआ तुझे, क्या हुआ बोल, ऐसे मत कर, पाजी, पाजी,
In the last few years, Benegal has made major documentaries. First, a feature-length film on Satyajit Ray, followed by a co-production with the Russians on Jawaharlal Nehru. Bharat Ek Khoj. The serial is an ambitious recreation of Indian culture and history and is based on the book Discovery of India by Pandit Nehru. Those familiar with his body of work insist that Benegal's films have been distinguished by an effort to reach out to a larger audience. He has done this without compromising his sensibilities or trivializing his own concerns as a filmmaker. In doing so, he has evolved a bridge between art and popular cinema. This, perhaps, is his major contribution as an artist to the world of Indian cinema.